Welcome, everyone, new viewers and old viewers, to another episode of The Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Crowley, DHA. This is the show where you learn all about conflict and negotiation, the what, the how, the when, the why. And I also bring in frameworks, research-based frameworks to help the topic at hand that's being discussed. Original mnemonics are also addressed. As an example, I have my original 5 A's of conflict resolution, which we've been journeying through in previous episodes. But for today, we do have a special guest. The last Friday of each month is reserved for guests. I have a special international guest joining us. But before I tell you more about her, this is how this episode will play out. So it's going to be 2 parts. Part 1 is going to be recorded, and it will entail an engaging interview/conversation with Margaret as she shares her perspectives on conflict resolution and, well, specifically, how you agree to disagree and mediation as conflict resolution techniques. Part 2 is not recorded, and that's when I invite our viewers to engage in stimulating conversation with us. Okay, so with not much ado, before I introduce you to Margaret, I would like you to reflect on something. I would like you to think about a conflict situation that you had recently, and you had to agree to disagree. What was the outcome? Did the work or business relationship continue? Just reflect on that. So with not much ado, I'll introduce Margaret to you right now by reading her bio. Margaret Crowley is an attorney and an owner of Crowley Mediation and a partner in Mediator Training Center. She has mediated approximately 1,100 cases. Margaret's private practice focuses on elder care, family, employment, and general civil mediation, as well as mediation and conflict strategies training. Margaret served for 5 years as the program administrator for Nevada's statewide juvenile dependency mediation program. In addition to serving as a Nevada Supreme Court mediator, Margaret has mediated for many court programs. Margaret teaches basic and advanced mediation trainings and is an adjunct professor for Boyd Law School and the National Judicial College. She also teaches for the University of Nevada, Reno, and the Nevada Supreme Court. Margaret has authored several published articles on mediation and received the 2020 Impact of the Year Award from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges for her work in dependency mediation. So I'd like to share with our viewers that Margaret is my first guest on the show. She happens to be an international guest, my nearby neighbor, since I'm Canadian, and she's from the States. So with not much ado, welcome, Margaret. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Cheryl, and for such a nice introduction. And I will say that I'm honored to be your first live guest.
Thank you very much. So tell us why you chose mediation for a career.
Well, I actually first chose law. I wanted to be a lawyer since the age of 8. So I was very bound and determined early on that that was going to be my career, and went straight from college to law school and then into practice, and practiced for about 17 years. But somewhere along the line, I realized that something was missing for me. And looking back at that, here's what I think was missing. Law is very much about logic, which I love, and about advocacy and applying the law to the facts of the case and getting a ruling. It's a lot about winning and losing. And some of that is fun. I love logic. I loved advocacy, and I loved winning, not so much losing. But I think what I realized along the way is that the law is not the best way to solve a problem because it doesn't address human needs, emotional needs. It really just is about what the law can give a person. So I kind of stumbled into mediation by taking a local 40-hour basic mediation training and immediately fell in love with this different way of looking at conflict and resolving conflict. And that class I took the end of 2008, and ever since then I have spent my time building this mediation practice and eventually segueing into teaching people how to mediate.
Wow. I think that's amazing that you knew pretty early on what you wanted to do for a career. Not many people are that clear, so that's impressive. So along the lines of now choosing mediation as a career, what type of employee business conflicts have you encountered before and during the pandemic?
So my practice is quite varied, as you could tell from the bio. I do a wide variety of cases, a lot of them family, but part of my legal background is human resources. And so business type cases that tend to come my way are employee relations kinds of cases. Sometimes I have had maybe family business issues. Perhaps the family wants to sell the business, it's time, but they can't really agree on how, or maybe things aren't working well in the family business and the family wants to have a conversation about that. A lot of that is because of the type of mediation I practice. Most lawyers practice what's called evaluative mediation, where they just look at the case and the case law and say, here's how I think the judge is going to rule. I actually practice what's called facilitative, and that is about facilitating a conversation and talking about what are people's needs or interests. And I think that's why human resources and family business cases tend to make it my way.
Okay, so it sounds like your practice is more holistic. In the sense, okay, I like that. Yes, I believe that holistic lenses is the way to go in resolving conflict, because it's not just one aspect. When you talked about from the beginning, emotional aspect of law. So yes, human beings are made up of the physical, the emotional, the cultural, and spiritual. So you can't just take one segment and just try and deal with it, in my opinion. So I'm happy to hear that. Thank you. So tell us about instances in your industry when parties are at an impasse but need to continue the relationship and mediation was helpful.
I'd say the key word there is relationship. So people come to mediation generally two different ways. Either they are ordered by a court and they have to come, or they come voluntarily. And I think that those who come voluntarily usually come because there's a relationship at stake. So perhaps it's a custody case and it's a co-parenting relationship. That relationship has to continue because those parties share one or two or multiple children in common, and they have to figure out how are we going to, get along? What is our future going to look like? Or those employment cases generally come my way voluntarily because it's the same thing. There's an employment relationship. It might be supervisor employee or employee to employee, but these are people who see each other on a daily basis, have to work on projects together. And if they are constantly disagreeing, hopefully they come to recognize they need to find a way to change the narrative in order to maintain that relationship. And that is what is so attractive to me about facilitative mediation. As you said, it addresses so many more aspects than, an evaluative type of mediation, because you are allowing people to express what's happening, but how does it make them feel? What is not only their position, but what we call the interest behind the position. Why is that their position? What's important to them? And mediation can be so helpful And when you're talking about a relationship, people fall into patterns of communication, and often they're dysfunctional. So one of the first things I generally tackle in a relational mediation is communication, and what does it look like, and how is it working, and often try to help parties to find a new and different way of communicating. And that's what really helps people maybe eventually come to some kind of agreement, or maybe agree to disagree, but understand one another so much better because they've had this facilitated conversation.
Yeah, I like what you said about positioning statements. And, well, you didn't use the word statement, but you said, what is your position? And I actually read a book, which is called Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In, by Roger Fisher, William Ury, and Bruce Patton. So he talks about positional statements and the bargaining for negotiation, but mediation is a little bit different, but you talk about facilitative and maintaining that relationship. So yes, I agree. It's very crucial to understand people's positions, because when they come into a conflict, some people have no idea what people's positions are. They just see the resistance. Would you agree? They just see the resistance, but without knowing the positions, how can you even begin to facilitate?
Well, and they might or might not know their position, but what Getting to Yes stands for, Getting to Yes really is what spurred the facilitative mediation movement. So it comes from that book. It's a very well-known, very famous book, great read. And it is about getting behind that position, to the interest, to the why. Why are you taking that position? So a lot of people don't know the why until they really sit down and talk through it.
That's right. So it sounds like they usually focus on what they want. They know what they want, but they may not necessarily know the whys. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. So I think you mentioned this earlier, but let's delve on it a little bit more and elaborate on it, if you will, please. So mediation doesn't always have to involve legal. Which resources in the workplace would you recommend for employees and leaders and managers to partake of for mediation practices?
I absolutely agree that mediation is not always something that takes place in the legal arena. And in fact, I'm a big fan of mediation that takes place outside of the court. And that's because if you as a business are resolving your conflicts in court, you have missed a whole bunch of opportunities along the way. It's an expensive, really long, protracted kind of way to resolve a conflict. And in the end, it's probably not going to help your business in the way that you need it to help. So, gosh, I could go so many ways with this answer. But there are multiple resources out there for businesses to understand conflict better. There are books, videos, 40-hour mediation trainings, art, all kinds of things. But let's back up a little bit and start with this basic premise that conflict is not a bad thing. I bet you've talked about this on your show. Our reaction to conflict is, I hate conflict. We can't have conflict in the workplace because we're going to break down. Things aren't going to go smoothly. So people just hide it. They keep it to themselves. It doesn't get addressed. And good business leaders recognize that conflict can actually be a wonderful thing. Most workplace conflict is either relational, people's relationships, they don't get along at work, or it's process. How do we do things, and we're not agreeing over how it should be done. A lot of studies that have looked at relational conflict will say this is not the good kind of conflict for a workplace. I understand that. But I also feel very strongly, having worked with so many businesses and done so many relational conflicts, that if you can recognize that's happening in the workplace and deal with it, either by having the skills as a leader to facilitate conversations, or making sure your HR folks have those skills, or bringing in an outside mediator, and dealing with those relational conflicts. That can obviously produce great results from conflict. Process conflict is really where the breakthroughs can happen, because when you have a process conflict, it means, I think we should do things this way. Well, I think we should do things that way. And if we have a conversation about, well, here's why I like, well, here's why I like this. And there's an environment in which those conversations are encouraged, and brainstorming is encouraged, and new ways of doing things, are looked at favorably. That's what leads to change. And we can probably all look at COVID as an example of this. So many business places, including mine, had to figure out, how do we shift in this COVID world? I'm in a profession that is about being in person. You mediate in person, you teach in person, and yet suddenly I couldn't do that anymore. I had to shift my own business model and adapt. And so the conflict was, really kind of process. I could no longer mediate in person, so I had to figure out a different way to do that. And that has changed really the course of my business, because I've realized, oh, there are new and different ways I can do things. This has happened in so many people's businesses, and it's just a great example to look at. It might be a non-traditional view of what a conflict is, but COVID created those kinds of process conflicts for work, and we found ways around them. So embracing conflict as a leader in an organization is step one, and I think you do that by understanding, listening to your theories on conflict, finding things that resonate with you to educate you about all of the great things conflict can bring, and just recognizing that conflict is, I like to say, it's not, most people think conflict is thumbs down. A few people think, oh, I like conflict. There's always those conflict drivers, but it's not simplistic like that. Conflict is like a diamond. It's multifaceted. There are so many things about it. So I know, very long answer, but there's a lot to say and dig into there.
No, very well said, actually. And actually, as you were speaking, 3 thoughts came to mind. The first one was, I like how you said that there's steps one can take prior to getting to mediation. And I like, because that ties in very well with, for example, when I talk about my 5 A's of conflict resolution, the first A is assess, the second is approach, the third is analyze, third is assert, and last is agree to disagree. Now, granted, like everything you said about conflict, it's not a linear process. It doesn't have to be a linear process. You might jump, but that's the framework that I chose to come up with. So I really like that you mentioned that. So by the time you get to mediation, things have really fallen apart. So the key, and I believe you will agree, is to empower people not to get to that mediation part of things. But the reality is sometimes that happens. And the second thing I like that you mentioned was about task-related conflict. Conflict, I agree. Sorry, you said process, forgive me.
But you're right, it's task. Task.
Semantics. Some people would use process and would say task, but you're absolutely right, because conflict, I see it as either a process or an outcome issue. So yeah, so I'm so glad you mentioned that. Thank you. And last but not least, when you talk about COVID, providing an opportunity for process changes in your business and businesses at large, that is so true. And that's a very optimistic way of looking at it. And that comment of yours actually reminded me of what I read elsewhere or heard elsewhere, that the Chinese character for crisis are 2 symbols: danger and opportunity. So what lens, what angle are you looking at this conflict? Is it a danger? Is it an opportunity? Could it be both? Food for thought. So
right, that's what that kind of diamond analogy goes back to. How diamonds are cut and they catch the light in different ways. They are multifaceted. So is conflict. And of course, I think most of us react to the danger part. We don't like to rock the boat. We like things to go smoothly, and we forget about the opportunity piece of it. And that's what really has been a COVID perk, is that we're forced. I would have told you before COVID, I can't do these multi-party high emotion cases that I do. My introduction talked about dependency. What that means is child abuse and neglect cases. So they're very, very challenging cases, lots of parties, super high emotions. And I would have said, well, I can't have 16 really emotional people on Zoom and conduct a mediation. And yet I didn't have a choice. I had to do that when COVID happened. And now I say, wow, it really is possible. I've learned so many ways to do it on Zoom and to utilize those tools as an advantage. And I know that there are people listening to this who can think of the same opportunities that COVID actually offered us to shift because we had no choice.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And hopefully people will be assured that, well, the same issues we're having in Canada is also experienced in the States, that it's not unique to one country or one locality as well.
I don't think so, yeah.
Thank you. So do you think that agree to disagree should be an option as a conflict resolution strategy? Or do you believe that one must always find a way to satisfy parties in a conflict? What are your thoughts?
I 100% agree that agree to disagree should be an option. So segueing from being a lawyer to being a mediator was challenging in many ways, but one of the challenges that I had was lawyers, like many other professionals, are very results driven. We talked about the win, the lose earlier. And so going into mediation, you tend to bring that with you, and that result is agreement. You define successful mediation as, oh, the parties reached agreement. It took me a while to recognize that's not what a successful mediation is. A successful mediation is, did everyone have an opportunity to talk about their positions, to talk about their interest, to look to the future and what's their vision, to hear the other party's perspective and appreciate it? That is a successful mediation. I'm very big on not forcing people into agreements, because we all know what happens. We all have been in that environment where we have been forced to do something. And generally it means we don't buy into it. If that happens in the workplace, for example, and we're forced to do things a certain way without any kind of input or respect for our position, people often end up leaving. They're dissatisfied. And so it doesn't do anyone any good in a mediation to force them to come to an agreement, because they're not going to have the buy-in. And I think where you see this most, there are all kinds of different conflicts, kind of like we've talked about. It may be process or resources or data. Those are conflicts that tend to lend themselves to some kind of resolution. But there are other types, such as relationship conflicts or value conflicts. And those are where I may see more agree to disagree, because taking, for example, a value conflict, something that we have also seen during COVID, vaccinations and how people feel about that and wearing masks, that's often a value conflict. And you really can't ask people to compromise their values. You might be able to find workarounds and ways that they can still move forward together as coworkers or as family members, but to try to tell someone that they have to compromise their values and what they believe in and who they are at the core just is not realistic, and it's not enduring. So that's really where I tend to see the agree to disagree. And I'm okay with that, because as I said, my job is Were they able to talk to one another and hear one another and respect one another? Everybody has a perspective. We need to respect that. And if that happened at my mediation table, then I'm absolutely fine if they agree to disagree, because now it's a much more informed agree to disagree.
Yes, well said, Margaret. So yeah, so thank you very much for bringing up that values conflict. It's one aspect that some people may hear about, but don't usually want to talk about or shy away from. So thank you so much for bringing that up. So I see that we have about 5 minutes left. And I'm so thankful for you sharing your expertise and your experiences as it pertains to mediation and agree to disagree for conflict resolution strategies. So people might be wondering, how can we reach Margaret? Do you have websites? Do you have some resources?
I do. I have both. I have a website. It's very simple. Just www.crowleymediation.com. So Crowley Mediation, all one word. And there's a bunch of places on my website where you can contact me. I love to hear from people. I'm obviously really passionate about this subject. I also, one of the things that COVID has pushed me to do is recognize that I can create trainings that are either live online or recorded, something I never thought about before. And so one of the things that I did during COVID was record a workplace communication, basically a resolving workplace conflict training. It's about 5 hours and it is available. There's a link on my website. I partnered with an education organization and we've had just really great feedback on it. And that tells me that a lot of people have conflict in the workplace and don't quite know what to do with it. And so what this course is to me is cherry picking the best techniques that I teach mediators, judges, lawyers, law students, therapists in a 40-hour training and condensing them down to a 4 to 5 hour training that really gives people tools for how to have these kinds of conversations that we're talking about. These sharing types of conversations where people can really look at each other and see each other as human beings rather than just as people we don't like or people we don't get along with. These are the kind of tools that I think we'd have a better world if we all learned them and knew how to use them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I believe your work is very valuable. It's timely. Not to say that prior to the pandemic it wouldn't have been timely, but I look at the pandemic as disruptive, both in a positive and negative sense. When you use that word disruptive, you have to be careful. So disruptive also in the sense of disruptive in innovations as well. So when you mentioned different platforms you can provide your services, that's an example of a positive disruption, right?
Right.
Positive. So great. Thank you so much, Margaret. So for you viewers and new viewers, I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Okoli, DHA. For those of you who may not know, this is a time shortly where we'll be ending. And I always like to leave you all with something, okay? I want you to remember this, that you are needed in this world to be a solution. Be the best that you can and do not rob the world of a precious gem, you. So see you same place next time. For those of you who will be joining us for part 2, same place next time. Thank you and have a splendid day. Goodbye.